Isquis Chichewasket, Pamela Barnes. It's my honor today to formally welcome you to the Syilx territory. And so before I do that, I want to share with you a little bit about what our lands mean to us. In this part of Turtle Island, which is how we refer to North America, the sharing of our lands with peoples from other places is fairly recent. It's about 200 years. Where other parts of Turtle Island, that history goes back 500 years, 1,000 years, depending on where you're speaking of. But here it's fairly recent. And with those coming together of different peoples from different places, came some new ideas about human relationship to the land, and that are very different from our traditional viewpoint about our relationship to the lands. And so one of those concepts is the idea of ownership, human ownership of land. And we as Syilx people see ourselves more of borrowing these lands from our great-great-great-great-grandchildren. We look at things in 7 generations. And there's a very big difference between those two ideas. So if I own this necklace, I can sell it, I can trade it, I can give it away. It's mine, I can do what I want. It's up to me how I choose to care for it. I can take great care, or I can toss it aside. Again, it's mine. I can do what I want with it. If I borrow this necklace, everything changes in those relationships. I cannot sell it. I cannot trade it. I cannot give it away. And there's an expectation that I take the very best care possible. And when I leave it or return it, that at least it's in the same condition I found it in, and if at all possible, in better. So those ideas are very different. And it's with that understanding of our relationship to these lands that we first welcomed people to the traditional unceded territory of the Syilx people. And so it's with that understanding that today I welcome you to the traditional unceded and currently occupied territory of the Syilx people, with the gentle reminder that none of us, including ourselves as Syilx people, are taking the very best care possible of these lands for all of our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and so on and so forth. Limlim.
Wai limlim. Kulun chuten kan wist. Tali hastis puus kana lab. Apanas khalkhald. Wai tskitski khayat nakhul wai kuts tu wilch. Ultali hasti ikal yatstim. Ikal marimsten. Ikal siul. Ikal stiltsel. Ikal squankl. Yatstim wai khulal. Wai skepchamul. Kekamis stjaak. Miku taku otikal temhula kukaus witsam kukaus tikum te yatstim. Tali hastis puus kitskala utlut shanum tulnych kui utlutak shanum. Tali hastis puus tluwikinsen apanas khalkhalt. Thank you, Creator, for allowing me to say a few words and a little prayer. Oh, I'm very, very happy that you have arrived here today. All the things that we do in a good way. At this time of year, it's springtime, and our people are going to go on the land and collect medicines and dig roots. And that's going to turn into summer. And then summertime, we're going to pick berries and go on the land and enjoy the land. The land is very beautiful. And it don't matter if it's raining or sun shining. The land is beautiful as we are, as you are. And I'm glad you got here safe and sound and that you return home to your home safe and sound. Thank you very much, my friends and relatives. Limlimt. Thank you. Have a good day. Wait.
All right, well, hello, everybody. Thank you all for joining us this evening. It's a pleasure to have you all once again join us for our BOMBHEAD lecture series. My name is Victoria Verge. I am the Education Coordinator of Adult Programming here at the Kelowna Art Gallery. And on behalf of the Board of Directors and staff, I'd like to thank you all for joining us. And I'll begin this evening's talk, of course, by acknowledging that the land on which the gallery stands is the unceded traditional territory of the Okanagan Syilx people. Now, tonight we are headed into our last lecture of the BOMBHEAD lecture series, which is accompanying the BOMBHEAD exhibition, which is in its final weeks here with us. So be sure to catch it before it comes down on July 18th. BOMBHEAD is a touring exhibition that is organized and circulated by the Vancouver Art Gallery and is presented here at the Kelowna Art Gallery with the support of our sponsor, IG Wealth Management. Tonight, last but not least, we have our guest lecturer, Michael Love, joining us to present his lecture titled The Aesthetics of Peril. So I'll give you a little bit of background info about Michael, and then I'll hand it off to him. So he was born in Chilliwack, BC, and is an artist based in Vancouver. He attended both the University of the Fraser Valley and Emily Carr University of Art and Design to complete his BFA there, and he received his MFA in photography from Concordia University in 2009. His photography has been published in S, Next Level, Prefix Photo, and Black Flash magazine. Love has exhibited his work both nationally and internationally and was a founder and curator of Gallery 295. In addition to his artistic production, Love has also been an arts instructor at the University of the Fraser Valley and Emily Carr University. So welcome, Michael. Very happy to have you. Just a few housekeeping rules before we dive in. I'm sure you guys have all heard this before since Zoom is a part of our lives now. But if you have any questions, please save them until the last 15 minutes or so of the lecture and just type them into the chat bar below. Make sure you've got your settings set to message all panelists and not set to private. And I should also let everybody know that tonight's lecture will be recorded. So if you know of anybody who might not be able to attend or be with us here tonight, just let them know that we'll have this recording available on our website as soon as possible. All right, well, that's it for me. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Michael.
Okay, thank you. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge that although we're situated in different locations right now, I'm giving my presentation from the unceded traditional and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And I was also born and raised on the ancestral territories of the Stolo Nation. My work is invested in unpacking and re-examining the different histories. And it is also important to be cognitive of this thinking while thinking about where we work and live. Sorry, stumbled a little bit, but we'll continue. I'm going to just maybe start by introducing myself a little bit. So as was said, I grew up in Chilliwack, BC, and actually maybe I'll just start sharing my screen right now. And where are we here? Sorry, I just have to, okay. So I was born and raised in Chilliwack, BC, and my family was there mostly because Chilliwack had a very large military base. So my grandparents, when I was a kid, all worked on the army base. So my grandfather was in the military as a soldier. My two grandmothers both worked in the offices on the base. And so it was sort of one of the main economic drivers in Chilliwack. So I spent a lot of time on the base. We used to, like, on occasion, they would have family days at the base, and they would we'd be able to get into the armored personnel carriers and drive around the city. So it was kind of interesting. I'm going to start with this image, and this is the tearing down of the Berlin Wall. This happened in 1989, which was one of the first news events that I sort of paid attention to. As well, in 1989, there was the Tiananmen Square massacre, which was also something that I spent a great deal of time sort of paying attention to. It seemed like there was a lot of change in the air, and that it was going to be like a positive change for the future. And out of that, Canada's sort of strategies for funding the military changed, which leads me to the first project that I'm going to discuss, which is CFD Chilliwack, or Garrison Crossings, as it's known as now. This is a map of Chilliwack. The part that's sort of circled in red is what was the military base. So Chilliwack's much different now. I don't know how many people know Chilliwack or have been to Chilliwack. Most people just sort of stop there for gas on their way through. But when I was a child, or pretty young, Chilliwack had about 16,000 people living there. And the two main economic drivers were the army base and farming. So in 1990, I guess around 1994, Crimean's government decided to sort of cut military spending, and they did it in sort of a strange way where they basically, if you didn't vote for the Liberals and you had an army base there, they were going to close it. So Chilliwack's army base was closed or decommissioned, and then the houses that you're looking at here, which are called PMQs, or primary married quarters, were then rented out to as low-income housing. But the base was sort of situated next to sort of a wealthier neighborhood, and there was complaints about, crime rates went up. People were concerned about drug use, and so eventually they decided to evict everybody who was living there. And this is sort of like images from the renovation phase. And then they sold all of those buildings to a developer, and I think they sold them each for like $1. And then this sort of renovation project happened where they turned all the military housing into sort of more modern housing. But they just basically renovated them, but they tore them right down to sort of the 2x4s and redid the whole thing. One of the reasons that they sort of didn't just tear everything down and start from scratch is that a lot of the military, the people who were in the military, would try to transfer to Chilliwack because they thought it was a good place to retire to. And so they didn't want to offend those people, but they also didn't want the low-income housing or low-income renters being in the neighborhood. So they evicted everybody, and then they started sort of tearing them down and making them into sort of modern homes. A lot of the buildings were moved. Single-story buildings were transformed into two-story buildings. Duplexes were cut in half and sort of turned into single dwelling homes. I must say that I actually spent quite a bit of time on the military base when I was young because my aunt and uncle lived there, so we would go and visit. And yeah, it was really strange to see this sort of endeavor happening. So I decided to go out and try and photograph it and sort of document it as it took place. So this is another single-story building that's been turned into a two-story building. And in the end, you know, there was all this work going on these spaces, and they ended up kind of looking similar to how they looked originally, except with the deck. So it was like this massive project that happened, and then it was like fundamentally they were sort of the same buildings. I talked to some construction workers about it, and they said they wouldn't buy them because they were basically a, you know, 40-year-old home that still had, you know, it was not new. So they were like, yeah, the floors would creak in the same way a 40-year-old building would creak, and they weren't that interested in it. So it, you know, it turned into this sort of weird suburb in Chilliwack. It's actually quite successful, but they took these buildings that were basically disposable, because the buildings were made sort of as cookie cutter buildings that could be like assembled very quickly and put up. And, you know, they took them and turned them into these homes, and then they sold them for like $500,000 a piece. So it's kind of an interesting space. That was before I did my master's degree. And when I went to Concordia to do my master's, I was sort of trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my work. And then on sort of the first field trip we did, I found this brochure for this place called the Diefenbunker. And I'm not sure how many people are familiar with the Diefenbunker, but the Diefenbunker was a nuclear fallout shelter that was built to house the Canadian government. And it's a massive structure. It was approved for building in 1958, and then was completed in 1962. Again, it was part of this decommission project that happened in the 90s. So the fear of the Soviet Union dropping bombs on Canada sort of diminished. So, you know, lots of these sites were no longer useful. In 1998, it was reopened as a museum. And so when I went here, it had been transformed into a museum. The military sort of took anything that was valuable or of interest and left with it, and then whatever they didn't think was needed anymore was left behind. The museum group sort of had this empty space, and I'll just say it's actually quite massive. So the Diefenbunker is underground, but it's 5 stories and there's over 500 rooms in it. It was supposed to house all the gold from the Canadian bank. There was a CBC radio station in it. There's operating rooms. There was lots of communication systems built into it. And it was really meant to house the entire government for about 3 months if there was a nuclear incident. And there's, you know, different operation rooms. The museum group, when they inherited the building, tried to refill the space with technology that they thought was available at the time. And so it's sort of this weird time capsule where each room is from a different era, and it doesn't really, at the time, didn't really make sense together. I don't think they had a lot of money, so a lot of the didactic panels were just sort of like hand drawn on like foam or cardboard. At this point, I think I was really interested in how these spaces that were created for a very specific function, a military function, could be co-opted or reimagined. And I think that was something that really started to push my explorations into the spaces I was investigating. This is a doctor's office. This was a dentist office. And so this was the first project that I did in my master's program. This is sort of one of the rooms in the basement. I think if you're ever in Ottawa, it's like a really interesting place to visit. From the outside, it doesn't look like anything. There's a lot of funny sort of stories about the Diefenbunker. Like, everybody knew it existed before it was completed, because they said it was a scientific research station, but then they had hundreds of toilets sort of parked in the yard, and someone flew over and took pictures of the toilets and realized that you wouldn't need that many toilets for scientific research station. It was actually obsolete by the time it was completed because the bombs had gotten bigger. But it was in operation for 40 years, and there was people stationed there for 40 years, just sort of watching, you know, waiting for something to happen. This is one of the washrooms. They also had to like pump the sewage out of it, so it was like kind of built really crazy. And then in 2009, I received what was called the Roll-Off Benny Travel Grant, and the Long Wait was a project that I shot in Germany, and during the Cold War, Canada sort of joined NATO basically in 1949, and in 1951 they started sending soldiers to Germany to be stationed there, and that led to a sort of a bigger operation. And there ended up being, I think at the height of the operation, there was close to 40,000 Canadians who were stationed in Germany. My grandfather was one of those people, which is why I kind of knew about this. And so Canada ended up having 10 military bases in the first section of the operation, which was, they were like an armored personnel, or sorry, they basically had tanks, and were there to sort of, if there was an invasion, to sort of bottleneck the Russian troops as they entered, and try to slow them down so that they could essentially drop nuclear weapons on them. The Canadian military bases were sort of located in the Ruhr Valley, which is sort of between Dortmund and Kassel. And this was one of the bases. This was Fort Victoria. So at first they had these 10 bases sort of in the north, and then at one point the funding was cut, and they actually turned in, instead of having tanks and sort of those sorts of weapons, that they became an air force. So originally Canada was serving under the UK, and then they switched over to serving under the US leadership. Each one of the Canadian bases had at least one church, and so it depended if there was both sort of Anglophone bases and Francophone bases. So the Anglophone bases had Protestant churches, and the Francophone bases had Catholic churches. So you could kind of tell which base you were on based on what style of church they had. And the French and English bases were often situated right beside each other. I think one thing that a lot of people don't know about Canada is that although we've never really owned nuclear weapons, during this operation, we had command over nuclear weapons. So with these radio towers, apparently we could launch nuclear weapons from the UK if need be. And we also had a number of what were called Honest John rockets, which were sort of borrowed from the US, and they were small rockets that would fire sort of a shell that would deliver the same payload as the bombs dropped on Hiroshima. I was pretty one of the things that I became very interested in this, in photographing this, is that you really sort of realize that there was a lot of leisure time. So there was like a lot of entertainment on the bases. There was, bowling alleys, gymnasiums. I think we found like a sauna in one of them. When they were decommissioned, so they were decommissioned actually around the same time. So like after 1989, they were decommissioned in 1994, I believe, and then returned to the German government in 1996. And so depending on where they were, some of them were useful based on their location and other ones were just abandoned. So Fort Chambly, which you're seeing here, those buildings were sort of sold, and there was like sort of a lot of industrial activity going on there. So like lots of sort of little machine shops and stuff, but then some of the buildings were also turned into housing. So you can see like people walking their babies and stuff. It was kind of interesting. Fort York, which you're seeing here, was turned into a German military base for a while. But then when I was there, it was resold to this guy who was training military and police on sort of dealing with different types of explosives, and he was actually blowing the buildings up one by one. But it was in really good condition because it'd been in part of the German. It was a German army base for a while. Fort McLeod, which you can see here, was being used as a refugee camp. So at the time, the Iraq War was going on, and they had a lot of refugees from Iraq who could stay there for free while they were sort of being processed. This was one of the Catholic churches, which is fancier in design than the Protestant church. This was Fort Prince of Wales. So this was now being used as a farm. So it was a sheep farm. But in the background, you can see there's those huts, or they were ammunition sort of depots, but that was where the nuclear weapons were stored. So that was where the Honest John rockets were being stored. And what I'm photographing from essentially was a berm that they made just in case there was an accident, that the explosion wouldn't wipe out the town behind me. Here's a bowling alley. And then, as I said, they sort of eventually became an air force in Germany. And this was one of the Air Force bases at Bad Solingen, and BMW was now using it as a test track. So BMW was testing their motorcycles there that day. These are just some of the other images. So this Fort York, the one that was maintained well. This was a movie theater at Fort St. Louis. Offices. This is the Protestant church, which is different than the Catholic churches. They sort of were also very cookie cutter, so all the churches looked the same. And this Fort Chambly was both an Anglophone and Francophone base, so it had both the churches. I think one thing that was really amazing for me was how quickly nature sort of took back the abandoned spaces. And this was the German Canadian Air Force Museum in Bad Solingen. So after that project, I started thinking about expanding from looking at just Canadian sort of sites. And then I was just listening to the radio one day, and they were talking about, I think it was the 80th anniversary of Artek, which sounded really fascinating to me. So Artek is a children's camp that was that's in Crimea, and it was sort of established by Lenin. I think it was in 1924, if I recall properly. sort of right before Lenin's death, as I understand it. And so it was a children's camp designed for the young pioneers. And I'm not sure if people are familiar with the young pioneers, but it was basically the communist version of Boy Scouts. And so I'm looking from here, I'm sort of overlooking the campsite, and the campsite sort of runs from where this photo is taken to the mountain in the background, which was called Bear Mountain. It's supposed to resemble the shape of a bear, apparently. But Artek was sort of a massive site, and it was sort of the size of a small city. I managed to get a Canada Council grant to photograph this project, and I was sort of really interested in how this site, which was really a tool for propaganda in a strange way, it was children from all over the world would come to Artek, and it sort of like instilled sort of doctrination into sort of communism, is sort of what you would say. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it sort of fell into the hands of the Ukrainian government, and the Ukrainian government couldn't really afford to run it the same way. So in the Soviet Union, children would be rewarded and were able to go to Artek. So if they excelled at school, or if their parents were like part of the Communist Party, they would get to go to Artek as sort of a reward, or as an exciting thing to do in the summer. And then, you know, underneath the Ukrainian rule, Ukraine was not a communist government. They sort of weren't interested in that sort of dogma, and sort of allowed children to go there, but you had to pay. So it was actually quite expensive to go to Artek. And it ended up that it was still mostly Russian children going there, but you know, they were paying a lot of money to go. At its height, there would be 16,000 children there at one time. So it's really the size of a small city. I think there was like 150 buildings. It had its own bus system to get around. When I was there, it was sort of at the low end of the season. I think they told us that there was, I think, 3,000 students that were, or children that were there at the time. But I had to promise that I wouldn't photograph children while I was there. So I sort of said I wouldn't do that. And we had to go on a tour and be guided around the whole time. It was really an interesting experience, and probably the most difficult thing that I've ever tried to photograph, just based on the restrictions that I had. I think I ended up only having 2.5 days on site, and was shooting with a large format camera. And it was every time I would, you know, it seemed like every couple hours they're like, "Are you done yet?" And I was like, "I haven't seen everything." So I you know, managed to stretch it out over a few days. I was really interested in sort of the leftovers from the communist era, and how they were still there, but kind of ignored in a certain way. All these sort of murals and statues, and a lot of it had been sort of, there wasn't a lot of money to maintain the site, so a lot of things had broken, or weren't being used anymore. There was Olympic-sized swimming pools that didn't hold water anymore. This was a school that they had there, so you could go to the school, and it was, you know, I think students spent a number of hours a day actually learning things on site. One thing that I thought was really interesting was that they really sort of thought of the space as promoting world peace, and children came from all over the globe. This is what they call the camper's globe, and it sort of had little marks on it from where everybody had come from. And so they're, you know, basically children from every single country in the world had been there, including Canada. If you look on the globe, there's actually a Canadian flag up near the top, and you know, it was really the Soviet Union saw it as a space that promoted world peace, which I didn't really know going there that was sort of the case, but yeah, it really seemed to be like a utopian sort of idea of what the world could be. In the 1980s, it was also used as sort of like for political sort of propaganda. They invited this girl, Samantha Smith, who had written a letter to the Russian prime president, sort of asking why they wanted to destroy America. And they said, oh, we don't want to do that. You should come visit and see what Russia is really like, or what the Soviet Union is really like. And she came and stayed for a couple of weeks, and it was sort of an event sort of that was televised all over the world. Her name was Samantha Smith. She ended up being on The Facts of Life, if people remember that show, but apparently ended up dying in a plane crash at one point, which is pretty tragic. But yeah, Artek was like a really interesting space. Yuri Gagarin had donated a bunch of space equipment to the site as well, which you know, every time I would ask what else there was to see, they'd surprise me with something. But the Space Museum was also like quite interesting. They had the second largest statue of Lenin in the world that they sailors actually use as a navigational marker because they're situated right on the Black Sea. And I've also heard that, well, I actually learned that since the annexation of Crimea, so this is situated in Crimea, if I failed to mention that, that the Russian government has actually spent something like $150 million revamping the site. It's very much embedded in Russian culture that that every child really wants to go to Artek. It's something that they know about, and you know, it's sort of this mystical place in a lot of children's minds. And I don't know if this is true or not, but I've heard rumors that it was part of the decision to annex Crimea with Sevastopol. The sort of Sevastopol is the port that the Russian military uses, or Russian Navy. Just gonna check the time. Okay. I'm gonna have to hurry up a little bit, but so in 2014, I did this next sort of body work based around the Cold War, which was called Enver Never. And this was a series of photos that was taken in Albania. And I'm not sure, most people don't know much about Albania, except that it's a little country in Europe. But Albania had this dictator named Enver Hoxha, and he was a communist dictator. And unlike most sort of communist leaders, instead of aligning himself with Stalin in Russia, he aligned himself with Chairman Mao in China. And they were very isolated, and actually never really ended the war, or never sort of, they were still at war with Greece technically after the Second World War. They never signed a peace treaty. They were so afraid that America was going to invade, and they weren't on very good terms with the Soviet Union. And then in 1972, when Richard Nixon visited China Hoxha became very upset with Mao and sort of cut ties with China as well. So they became completely isolated in the world. And he went on this massive defense spending program where he built all these bunkers. And he built essentially about 150,000 bunkers throughout Albania. And they're different sizes, and they're sort of spread out in a ring from the center of Albania. So you could basically find these anywhere. I was sort of interested in how people might be reusing these spaces. I heard rumors that people were sort of using them as homes and sort of building them into different sorts of restaurants and you know, you name it, they were using it for it. And I didn't see a lot of that as much as I thought I would, but I was really interested in this idea of taking this military structure and sort of reimagining it. And so, you know, it was sort of an interesting project in the fact that it wasn't that hard to find the bunkers. You could just sort of find them. And it wasn't like I was going to photograph every bunker that I found. It was sort of like the ones that I was interested in, I could photograph. So this one was like one on the beach that was being used as a little restaurant or cafe. These were just sort of in the hills overlooking the valley. A lot of them were sort of put on farms. They sort of, the Hoxha died in 1985, and then they sort of had a revolution, and they're a democratic country now. At one point, their leader said, if you've got a bunker on your property, you can essentially do whatever you want with it. So a lot of people started tearing them down, especially during the economic crisis in 2008. They started like tearing them down and taking the rebar and selling the rebar from them. But some of these spaces still existed as sort of like businesses. So this is a tattoo parlor. It was called Apocalyptic Tattoos. And Albania is sort of very embarrassed of that history. I think, you know, like a lot of people disappeared during that time. People were forced into like they basically had to donate their time to building the bunkers. So like everybody in Albania at one point was building bunkers for the government, and it ended up bankrupting the country. And so when you talk to Albanians, they were sort of like, a lot of them weren't very excited about the bunkers. And so there's not a lot of preservation happening of those sites, but yeah, it's sort of an interesting part of their history. And I think as sort of tourists start to realize that they're there, it seems like something that people are interested in. They're sort of, some people are starting to be interested in keeping some of them. This was, I stumbled across this, which was beside one of their government buildings. They had all these communist statues that were sort of hidden in the back and covered up. And I thought it was very sort of telling about how they felt about that era of their history. So in 2018, I was accepted into a residency in Quebec. It's called the International Symposium of Contemporary Art, where you were supposed to make work on site, which I'd sort of started looking at archives and decided to sort of pursue this project called, which became called Shadow Architecture. This is an exhibition of that work. And with this project, I went through the Library of Congress in the United States archive and basically went online and just typed in Cold War and looked for images. And I think there was 168,000 images that popped up. And then I sort of went through and collected the ones that I wanted. With this, I sort of found images that I wanted, and I cut out pieces and sort of tried to manufacture my own architectural structures using those pieces. And so, oops, that's not the title. These are all called architectural studies. And so I was really interested in sort of the United States sort of coming into being a superpower and how that happened. And so a lot of the material that I used were sort of construction sites or sort of documents of military bases. There's like chemical manufacturing facilities, nuclear launch sites. And so this was sort of taking them apart and reassembling them and trying to reimagine these sites. I think one thing that I was really thinking about was how these places that were sort of all over the world were connected, and sort of how I could sort of like look at all these images that were from all over the place. And, it seemed disjointed when you'd look through this archive of images, but how they all connected together. And I think that's one thing overall that I've been trying to do with these projects, is to connect these different sites and try to piece together the history. Most of these images were also at one point classified, so you wouldn't be able to see these sites. And yeah, just sort of reassembled them, trying to reimagine or make propositions for what could have been potentially. So this is one of the pieces. So they're cut out quite accurately. You can see it on the end of this structure here. I think I've got a couple minutes left, so I'll just go through this newer project that I've been working on called Imagined Histories. With these images, I'm taking photographs of nuclear tests, and I'm basically taking out the nuclear explosions. I'll just show you. So this was the one. So I've basically edited out the nuclear blast. And part of me is sort of like, again, trying to reimagine a different history and what happens if we never invented this technology. I think nuclear energy is this Pandora's box that once we've figured out how to make a nuclear bomb, we can never go back. It's fundamentally sort of changed how people interact with one another globally. Anyways, I think I'm basically out of time now, so I think I might leave it there, and we'll open it up for questions.
Wonderful, thanks, Michael. That's like such a cool idea, erasing because I saw the first image with like just the black and white with the clouds, and I was like, that looks familiar, but I don't know why. And meanwhile, it's something I've been staring at in BOMBHEAD for like the last 4 months.
Yeah, it's I think that's like an ongoing one. I keep on every once in a while. I'll start working on one. So
yeah, no, it's so cool to see that stark contrast, the difference between it existing and not existing. Yeah, so like Michael said, we'll open it up for questions now. So if anybody has any wonders or questions or comments, please feel free to type them into the chat, and I'll vocalize them for you, Michael, just so that we've got a recording of them.
okay.
Yeah.
I'll stop screen sharing now. How about that?
There we go. Perfect. While we wait for some of the audience members to type in their questions, I'll ask you my question. I have a couple of questions, but as you were going through your talk, I know that there's a lot of photography in BOMBHEAD in the exhibition, and photography it's so important for documentation of history. But as an artist, of course, you would look at it through a little bit of a different lens. So I'm just wondering, how do you know when to take the right shot? Because I'm sure you're inundated with just like visual inspiration, but yeah, what makes you make the decision to click?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think with a lot of the projects, especially, you know, I'm thinking of like the Diefenbunker or even CFB Chilliwack, like there's only so many spaces, and I think it's sort of like making aesthetic decisions and what I find interesting. I always try and have like a very formal approach to the way I'm doing photography. You know, I think of artists like Lynn Cohen or Stan Douglas who, you know, are very particular about their framing, and that's sort of been something that I've tried to do. I also try to be very, I think one of the reasons for that is to be as objective as possible. And I think even with the naming of my images, I try to like be very matter of fact, without sort of giving too much, you know, with sort of like, I kind of want the viewers to be like, what does this person mean by this title? Like, where is this? What does this mean? And so like, I kind of want the viewers to do a little bit of work, if that makes sense. But yeah, I think the project I shot in Albania was very different. So like when I was at Artek, it was like, it was very like, we gotta go, like you guys gotta get out of here, we don't really want you here. Like, you still want to be here taking photographs, sort of thing. I felt very rushed and like, okay, like I see this thing, it looks great, I'm gonna take a picture. I think when I went to Albania, it was like this very different way of photographing, because I had time. Like the bunkers weren't going anywhere, I could kind of get access to them very easily. So I would drive around during the day when it was really hot out and like the sun was like high in the sky, and it wasn't very ideal for photographing, and sort of scope stuff out and be able to come back later on when it was like the light was nice, you know, which was very sort of liberating in a way. So yeah, but and also with that, it was sort of like, it was like I could look for interesting compositions.
Yeah, you had more choice in the matter, more time to get the lighting right and get the composition right. But it's interesting to see what comes from being rushed as well, because even those images at Artek, they still look incredibly well thought out composition wise. So, so
I can work fast when I need to, I guess.
We all can, I think. We'll throw it together. Okay, so I've got a couple of questions here. So if you don't mind, I'll read those out.
Sure.
So Andreas says, thanks for the insightful talk, Michael. If you would permit a few questions. Firstly, as your projects deal with the reuse and transition of former military sites, I'm wondering if there are currently active sites that you fantasize about documenting as they assume different forms. Secondly, you spoke to some of the logistical challenges that you faced with the Artek project, but I'm wondering if you could speak a little more about your process of obtaining access and permission. Finally, have you considered working with the Canadian Forces Artist Program? You would be a great fit.
All right. Hi, Andreas. So let's start with the first question. Current sites. So, I mean, I don't know about like sites that are being super active, but there are a few sort of like bucket list sort of sites that I've been interested in. One of them is I'm really interested in going to Kazakhstan at some point, which is where the Soviet Union did their nuclear tests. So I mean, there's places that I've been that I didn't include in my talk. So like I went to White Sands, like the White Sands missile range in the States, which is where essentially the atomic bomb was created or first tested. But yeah, I'm pretty interested in going there. The Soviet Union, when it broke up, sort of just abandoned that site, and it's super toxic. And there's tons of people with birth defects in the area, and it's just sort of left as like this really strange, ominous site. Like the architectural structures there are like really sort of crazy. They built like towns to blow up and stuff. So that's one place. I'm also interested in the States. There's like a lot of nuclear, old like decommissioned nuclear launch sites that have now been transformed into houses. So I'm kind of curious about that. And then logistical challenges. How do I get access? So, I mean, Artek was really crazy. So when I was trying to get into Artek, I basically contacted anybody I could get a hold of that might have a link to getting into Artek. So someone that I knew in Montreal knew the guy who opened the only contemporary art gallery in Ukraine, who had also done a project at Artek. So I like tried to contact them. I was talking to that person's daughter who was living in Canada. And I think eventually the daughter said, "You're never going to get access from Canada. Like, you just have to go and find someone and take them out for a drink," is what she told me. And I was like, okay. And so like I had a Canada Council grant, and it was pretty, like, I didn't want to like go and then not be able to produce the project and potentially have to give the money back. But I paid to get to Crimea, and I rented a place in Yalta, which is just outside of where Artek is. And when I booked it through some guy in the UK, and when I got there, I think the woman running the place usually rented to men looking for mail order brides, which was a real thing. So I showed up with my partner, and she's like, "Oh, what are you doing here? Like how come you're in Yalta? Are you wanting to go look at palaces or go to the beach, or like, why are you here?" And I was like, "Well, I'm trying to photograph at Artek." And she's like, "Oh, well, my daughter-in-law works there. Let me see what I can do." and she actually, her daughter-in-law didn't think anything would happen, but she made some phone calls and managed to find someone who was the right person to talk to. So it just worked out. With other places, like in Germany, with a lot of the spaces, I just showed up and just said like, "Hey, my grandfather worked on these bases. Can I take a look around?" And no one said no. So I think a lot of times it's just a matter of asking.
Yeah.
And then was third part of the question?
The Canadian Forces Artist Program seems
Yes.
to hit the nail on the head there.
Yeah, so actually I have applied to the Canadian Forces Artist Program, and I have been accepted, and I got accepted right before COVID hit, and so I am on hold. But I applied to go back to Ukraine because Canada's training Ukrainian soldiers currently. So I want to go and sort of see what's happening there. Okay.
Perfect. Oh, Andrea says, "Thanks for the stories. Hope to see you soon. Congrats on the Canadian Forces Artist Program acceptance." Linda has a question here and is asking, has there been one of your projects that has stood out most for you or has had the most impact for you?
I mean, I feel like I really like the images aesthetically from Artek. I don't know if I would say that has had the most impact, but yeah, I'm trying to think of what would have the most impact on me. I think that's a really hard question in a way. Maybe, I think maybe the Diefenbunker maybe had the most impact because I think it was sort of like the realization that that was like a mode of working that I could pursue, or like an interest as well. Like, I think CFB Chilliwack was kind of too close to home. It was just sort of like, you know, this is sort of like this interesting that thing that's happening down from my parents' house, essentially. And it didn't at that point didn't seem like a broader project. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. We'll move on to Alyssa's question. And they're asking, how do you feel about taking a more active role in the manufacturing and altering of landscapes versus how you were documenting landscapes in your earlier work? Will you explore this more in the future?
Yeah, so I think I would say the first time that I did this was in a work that I didn't include, which I had a residency at the CBC in Vancouver to make a sort of very large print. And so I started digging through their archive in order to manufacture something. And mostly I did that just because of what they were asking for, in a way. I'd sort of thought about it before, sort of like building my own sort of landscapes. As a mode of working. I think one thing that I've found is that with the advent of digital, images are so accessible that I think like I get a little frustrated because, and I'm sure a lot of photographers feel this, is that you like find something that's interesting and you do a Google search and then you find like 1,000 images of that thing that you were interested in and you're just like, oh, like it's been done. And I also, you know, like these projects cost a lot of money. So I've had to rely on funding for a lot of the projects in order to create them. And sort of that in between time where you're trying to come up with funds in order to produce something, I find a bit frustrating. So it's just I was just like, I just want to be able to work without having to rely on funds. So yeah, I've been sort of working in that mode a little bit more lately, just as something that I can sort of continue at home.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Yeah, it almost bridges on collage and photography, and you're making these otherworldly fantasy realms with these buildings that exist, but when you put them together, it's really interesting project. I loved seeing those images.
And I think like I started building them in the computer and it felt really flat and like not what I wanted, which is why I started cutting them out and sort of assembling them, was to sort of give it more three-dimensional depth.
Yeah.
And sort of, but it's also only works from one perspective, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, it makes a big difference. And actually, when I first saw them, I thought they were like digital collages, but knowing now that you go through and you cut out in such fine detail and layer them together, like it's not only the decision-making process, it's also there's a lot of time then spent with each individual image, maybe more so than there would have been just in selecting them, but you're also really doing the work on them too. Okay, well, I don't think we have too many more questions at the moment. Yeah, I really, really appreciate your time spent here with us tonight, Michael. It was fascinating. I love learning more about your work. We've got some thank yous coming in here, so the audience seems to echo my thoughts as well. Is there anything you'd like to say before we finish up?
Well, I'd like to thank you guys for the invitation. That was great. BOMBHEAD was an amazing show in Vancouver, so it's like really great that you guys got to host it. And thanks everybody for coming. It's been really, really nice to think about my work again.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. And like I said, BOMBHEAD is here in Kelowna for another week and a bit. So if you're in town, please come check it out. We're so happy to be able to show it off here in our town. And thank you all for joining me for the lecture series. It's been so great to have such established lecturers join us over the past couple of months. It's been wonderful to learn more about everybody's practices. And thank you everyone for joining us. There will be more programs like this in the future, so keep an eye out on our website for up and coming content. There's always new stuff to discover. Okay, well, I will leave everybody at that. Thanks again, Michael, and have a good night.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye.